What do you get when you combine the firepower of a machine gun with the portability and accuracy of a rifle? Oddly enough, a pretty beloved weapon, which in this case is the Browning automatic rifle, better known as the M1918 BAR. The BAR was a staple of the American military in the first half of the 20th century, becoming a favorite of doughboys and GIs from France to Guadalcanal, managing to remain a dependable weapon in combat some 20 years after it became obsolete. Weighing in at around 15 pounds in its original form and beefed up to just under 20 in later variants, the 30-06 automatic rifle, even in all its glory, was very much a product of its time, designed to provide a solution to the meat grinder modern combat was becoming as the 1900s progressed, by utilizing the theory of so-called walking fire. Another product of the prolific firearm-producing prodigy John Moses Browning, and oddly enough the weapon that immortalized his name despite nearly 40 years of work up to that point, the BAR more than deserved the praise it would garner in its 50-plus years of service, though the weapon was by no means perfect and certainly had a few shortcomings. So what prompted the need for an automatic rifle? How well, if at all, did the BAR fulfill the role it was designed for? And why did soldiers become so fond of a type of rifle that has largely died out in contemporary usage? Let's begin where all good history videos do. Runtime padding. Enlightening background and context. The First World War had radically altered the understanding of how war worked. I know everyone loves to parrot the Fallout line, but war fucking changes, and a large part of that change had been the widespread usage of machine guns. The Germans were the first to fully embrace machine guns in the way we see them used today, and after having millions of men decimated across several battles in the early parts of the war, the French and British would follow suit, as would have the Russians if their country wasn't spiraling down until it hit the bedrock known as communism. Unfortunately, purchasing a shit ton of machine guns only really meant that everyone else could kill millions of men, and the problem of losing the population of a small town every time anyone went on the offensive remained. At some point around 1915, a military Frenchman realized that soldiers equipped with bolt-action rifles and maybe a couple of grenades or a pistol needed more firepower, and after coming back from his 2-hour lunch break, the idea of walking fire was born. Well, at least in the context of 20th century warfare. Walking fire is a pretty simple concept. Fellas armed with automatic weapons lay down fire while walking across no man's land to suppress the enemy and allow their boys to destroy enemy machine gun positions with grenades and then breach their trenches. To fill this new role, the French, after yet another lunch break, would create the M1915 Showshat, while the British would be lazy and just purchase a .303 chambered variant of the American-made Lewis gun, though both weapons were riddled with problems. Their magazines, interestingly, were the root cause for the majority of them, the Showshats being open-sided for some godforsaken reason, so they often jammed with dirt, and the Lewises just made an already overly bulky design even bulkier, along with being a pain in the arse to load. The US military, twiddling its thumbs across the pond while Europe deleted 14% of its male population, saw the promise of walking fire, and knowing they'd be dragged into the war one way or another, began searching for their own automatic weapons. And luckily, a familiar face had been designing just the firearm they were after. By the time World War I was in full swing, John Moses Browning had become an unsung legend in firearm manufacturing, and if you want to know how all that happened, I have 30 minutes of yapping about him that you should definitely go and watch. Amongst his many projects during the early 20th century, Browning had been mulling over a design for an automatic rifle based on his M1895, first putting pen to paper at Colt Firearms sometime between 1910 and 1912. But the start of the war to end all wars would give this backburner design a newfound priority, as he too had realized that the US would eventually find itself fighting in Europe. So Browning again channeled his power of creation and spawned a gas-operated automatic rifle utilizing 20-round box magazines with a strong receiver, heavy barrel, and a small number of robustly made internal components, envisioned to be issued along with bandoliers to allow an infantryman to carry several hundred rounds to minimize the impact of the small magazines, and was chambered in the same 30-06 round as American rifles to allow for simpler logistics as well as for soldiers to share ammunition. In typical Browning fashion, he had over-engineered the weapon to be practically impervious to anything the rigors of combat could throw at it, but two things remained: proving it was any good as a military rifle, and then getting anyone to buy it. Luckily for Browning, the US military was in a bit of a predicament by 1916. You see, the US military are often a traditional bunch, and change is quite scary for them, something Browning himself and Maxim, his contemporary, would experience firsthand when trying to sell them automatic firearms in the late 19th century. When
Mexicans
invaded across the US border in 1916, the expedition carried out to capture the man responsible would 1. Result in failure to do so, and 2. Expose just how ill-equipped the US was, especially with their machine guns. By the end of the expedition, the US was on the brink of entering the war, having at most 1,300 machine guns, so the Secretary of War demanded tests of light machine guns and automatic rifle prototypes a month after Congress voted to officially enter the conflict in 1917. Browning's design was among these, having already been shown to military officials in February, and swiftly outclassing much of the competition with ease, the 30-06 Showshat having typically French reliability, and the Lewis gun being so shit it was quickly relegated to aircraft use only. Browning's design would fare a little better, mainly due to its lower weight, more reliable magazines, and semi-automatic capability, which allowed for single accurate shots along with suppressive fire. So, impressed by the prototype, by July 1917, the military had begun issuing contracts for the Browning-designed automatic rifle, which itself would go through several name changes, including the Browning machine rifle, Browning air-cooled gun, and light Browning. The first contract going to Colt, as they already shared the design rights to the weapon. If you thought that all this seems a little too easy, it's at this point that Browning's automatic rifle encountered several major fucking headaches. While the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, as it would come to be known, would see combat in World War I, it would take over a year from the contracts being issued for the rifle to be found in the hands of American soldiers. This was mainly because, well, no one could really make it. Colt was supposed to make 12,000, but couldn't get their shit together for 7 months. The government forcing them to share the rights with Winchester and Marlin Rockwell wouldn't help much either, with neither contractor able to get a rifle delivered until the end of 1917. Simply put, they were already at capacity with orders for other small arms for the Americans, British, and Russians, along with several delays caused by the painstaking bureaucratic process every change Browning made to the weapon had to go through, and resulting in him being given sole authority over design approvals. Even as the US military did everything it could to just get the rifle in the hands of its soldiers, including skirting around licensing issues by scamming Browning out of between $5 and $12 million in royalties, the commander of American forces in Europe then began roadblocking its deployment. 17,000 BARs had been produced by July 1918, but John Pershing, despite being enthusiastic about the design, was worried it may fall into the hands of the enemy, and possibly even reverse-engineered. So instead of issuing the rifle, he ordered all BARs arriving in Europe to be stored in ordnance depots, though this could have also been due to the logistical nightmare the American Expeditionary Forces were, as well as delays in establishing maintenance facilities for the weapon, or just wanting to wait until there were enough to arm more troops. Whatever his problem was, finally, in September 1918, after over a year of having to sully themselves by using British or, God forbid, French automatic weapons depending on where they were stationed, the M1918 would first be issued to doughboys just in time for the Meuse-Argonne offensive, kicking off half a century of military deployments. Although the BAR was one of the last new weapons to see combat for the first time during the Great War, trailing behind even the first combat-deployed submachine gun, the MP-18, the few months the M1918 helped defeat the Central Powers would make it quite popular indeed. The BAR would garner fame even before it reached Europe. A public test of the rifle in February 1918 in front of congressmen and a wealth of reporters being so successful that Browning walked away with the nickname of the Wizard of Firearms. Oddly enough, this being the moment he truly gained widespread recognition despite his many achievements by that point. As mentioned, the Meuse-Argonne offensive would be the first combat trial of Browning's rifle, and it has often been said that the first man to fire the BAR in combat was Browning's own son Val. While it is true he was issued the BAR and was part of the 79th Division for the offensive, it's unclear how accurate this statement is, but there's no doubt he was among the first, and he would even go on to teach other soldiers how to operate and maintain his family's designs. In combat though, the impact the BAR had was felt immediately, which came with its own problems, but we'll get to that. Issued along with several 6-magazine bandoliers and a belt-mounted cup to stabilize the stock during walking fire offensives, the BAR quickly gained the favor of American infantrymen, being much more reliable than the jam-prone Shoshat and much simpler to operate than the bulky Lewis. In addition, the BAR's ahead of its time select fire operation garnered its significant praise as well for the rifle's versatility. However, all was not sunshine and roses for the Americans in Europe, as it rarely ever is. While certainly increasing the firepower of a unit, the BAR would also essentially paint a giant fucking target on its operator, the German soldiers realizing quickly that it would be a lot easier to repel American advances if they weren't shooting quite so many bullets at them, resulting in reports stating that units were losing half their automatic rifles in a matter of days. Even worse was that spare parts were not being issued, so even if BARs were recovered, any that had been damaged could not be replaced in the field. But then, in November, the war ended, and while it had garnered widespread praise from those who were issued it, the Browning automatic rifle had only been issued to a little over 17,000 troops, and of those, just over 4,500 would see any combat. It was a promising start, but had the automatic rifle really been worth its salt, or was it just some late war luck? If there was anyone who was just slightly perturbed that the war had come to an end, it was Colt, 'cause, war profiteering. You see, the US had been expecting the war to continue into 1919 at least, but the sudden end to the conflict in November 1918 would cause the military to toss half their orders into the fire, BARs included. In total, 186,000 M1918 orders were cancelled, and Colt, retaining the rights to the weapon, immediately set about selling the BAR to pretty much every market they could. So for the next 2 decades, Colt would pump out commercial BARs in a fashion that would make John Browning himself blush. Their first model would emerge within months of the armistice, known as the M1919 Colt machine rifle, which was pretty much just the same as the model they were supplying to American soldiers. The next would be the Model 1924, featuring a pistol grip, a shorter forearm, a rate of fire reducer, as well as Browning's own patented ejection port and hinged magwell covers. This then followed by the Model 1925, also known as the R75, which was the same as the M1924, but with a heavy finned barrel and a spiked bipod, increasing the weight to some 20 pounds. Looking to more aggressively target the law enforcement market, Colt produced the R80 in 1931, a lighter R75 nicknamed the Monitor, with no bipod and a new compensator, and then going on to produce an improved R75 known as the R75A. But despite all these efforts, they could only muster sales of a pathetic 5,000 BAR variants between 1919 and 1942. Meanwhile, Browning would again partner with his Belgian friends to distribute Colt's commercial variants internationally under license. The FN Model 30 sold to thousands of customers across Europe and Latin America, and in fact, during World War II, every faction fighting in Poland had reported fielding licensed BARs in small numbers. In addition, the US military had been tinkering with Browning's design too, primarily trying to improve its horseback capabilities. For some reason, the Americans were still obsessed with their horses in the early interwar years, and would test several BAR variants which, after several revisions, finally resulted in the M1922 cavalry machine rifle, which somehow remained in service for some 20 years, though there is little evidence it ever proved its merits on horseback in combat. The production of BARs in the interwar years is often forgotten, however, as the dramatic exploits of the rifle during this time paint a far more interesting picture. While mostly remembered today for its valiant service in battling fascism, the BAR's reputation in the interwar period was much murkier than you might expect. The M1918 would remain in service with the US military during this time, Marine forces notably making use of Browning's rifle in Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and even China as it was slowly infected with communism. But the BAR was making headlines a lot closer to home than many Americans probably would have liked. The notorious Barrow Gang, led by Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, carried out several robberies and engaged in multiple shootouts across the American South, equipped primarily with Browning-made BARs and 1911s, repeatedly robbing armories specifically for these weapons and their ammunition during their crime spree. Clyde himself would put the Call of Duty developers to shame and weld 3 BAR magazines together to increase magazine capacity, and many of the BARs the gang stole would be sawed down so they could be fired out of vehicles, which they playfully nicknamed scatterguns. Bottom line was, they liked the BAR, and funnily enough, so did the law enforcement trying to catch them, the 30-06 chambering being able to pierce vehicles much better than, say, the .45 caliber Thompson. Eventually, the law caught up with Bonnie and Clyde, an ambush of BAR-equipped badgers riddling the star-crossed lovers with 130 rounds of 30-06, and in the back of the car they had been driving were several so-called scatterguns on the back seat. This is just one example, and throughout the war on organized crime in the 1930s, the BAR would remain a common fixture in the hands of both the law and those intent on breaking it. But a new war was on the horizon, and the US military began ordering new BARs on an unprecedented scale. America would once again be a little late to the party in World War II, but this time they'd kept on top of modernizing their arsenal, procuring several improvements to the BAR over the interwar years, such as the M1922 and then the M1918 A1, which had been standardized in 1937 but mainly exported to America's allies. These interwar models were far from perfect, most being declared obsolete by the US military by the time Hitler began gobbling up his European neighbors, and it was evident that a new variant would be needed for the oncoming war. Developed mostly from existing M1918 stockpiles, in 1938 the foundations were laid for what ultimately became the M1918 A2 the next year, featuring a new bipod, flash suppressor, rear sight, magazine guides, shortened handguard, and a new fire selector which removed the semi-auto function. When the Nazis and Communists put their differences aside to bully Poland together, the US had some 87,000 BARs, and until late 1941, most of their efforts focused on modernizing their existing inventories of rifles. But then, the Japanese touched their boats. America's entry into the largest conflict in human history would come with immense industrial mobilization, and the BAR would be ordered in the hundreds of thousands, contracts going to the specially created New England Small Arms Corporation and IBM. But despite the might of American industry, it would take nearly 2 years for new rifles to roll off production lines. The first problem was the antiquated machinery, the US military assuming the new BAR could be produced on the machinery left over from World War I, which, funnily enough, it couldn't. The other problem was material shortages, the high-grade steel for the internals and the walnut needed to furnish it being in critically short supply, forcing the contractors to find alternate means of making the rifle. This would manifest in the form of the M1918 A2's futuristic plastic stocks introduced in March 1942, along with the use of Saginaw Malleable's more efficient armor steel to construct receivers and internals. Other modifications were floated during the war as well, including a T4 carrying handle which was approved in late 1944, and a new trigger mechanism to permit the use of semi-automatic fire in the A2 variant, which would result in the T30 conversion kit after the war ended. In all, some 200,000 BARs were produced for the fight against fascism, pretty much all of them by the New England Small Arms Corporation, and they would prove even more valuable to American troops than ever before. World War II saw the most widespread deployment of Browning's automatic rifle ever, the M1918 becoming the best friend of American infantry in both Europe and the Pacific. For much of the war, squads would be deployed with one BAR-equipped automatic rifleman, but as the value of automatic fire in modern warfare became realized, troops' demands for BARs boomed. 2 to 3 issued per squad by the war's end instead of the single M1918 issued initially. Facing off against German and Japanese infantry, both of which operated squads structured around their automatic weapons, the BAR became a crucial component of American campaigns, primarily functioning as an anti-machine gun and anti-sniper weapon, helping bolster American firepower as well as the morale of troops. On the European front, the M1918 had saved the lives of many during the hard-fought invasions of Italy and France, often being the only thing preventing many units from being overrun altogether, and even being one of the weapons that earned James One-Man Army Spurrier his nickname and Medal of Honor in 1944. However, the second tour to liberate Europe would expose that, as a light machine gun, the BAR was pretty shit. The magazines were tiny, and the barrel cooled about as well as an iPhone left in the sun, which forced many soldiers to fire their rifle to the point of failure in an effort to save their squads. But the M1918 would prove an effective counter to enemy snipers in Europe, and even more so in the Pacific. The Pacific theater of the Second World War was like walking blindfolded through a minefield, and during the brutal island-hopping campaigns, the BAR provided a unique advantage. its tree destruction capabilities. You see, Japanese forces, and especially their snipers, were well known for hiding in terrain to ambush American troops, but, well, trees and bushes aren't going to protect you from 20 rounds of 30-06, and in fact, American soldiers during the interwar period had used BARs to help cut through jungle terrain. So, BAR men became focused on shooting trees, eventually so much so that they forgot to check other spots Japanese soldiers hid in and ended up getting shot in the back. With the extensive game of hide-and-seek that the Pacific Theater evolved into, BARs often found themselves pointed at the entrances of Japanese tunnels, caves, and bunkers that American soldiers would usually set ablaze or just blow up. Which was totally humane, trust me bro. Again though, all was not perfect. Many Marines would remove the bipod, buttplate, and even flash hider to lower the weight of their M1918s, and the weapon was known to be a shitshow to maintain in the jungle. But the most common complaint was the high recoil from the automatic first setting, a problem the US military had invented by removing the semi-automatic fire selector from the original. By the time fascism was defeated and communism became the new enemy, Browning's automatic rifle had been issued in the hundreds of thousands, garnering not only praise from soldiers, but also being featured in a number of medal citations across multiple fronts. And this is just with the Americans. France, Belgium, Poland, Sweden, and China all fielded BAR variants as well. Despite its flaws, the rifle designed for World War I had proven its worth for mid-20th century combat, and somehow still had some fuel left in the tank. As the Cold War kicked off, war was changing once more, and despite its best efforts, unfortunately the BAR would be left behind. Initially, the M1918 looked to remain a staple of American military action, shipped off to Korea in the early 1950s, but it was clear that its time was coming to an end, mostly because the US military just assumed what worked in World War II would work in Korea, which it didn't. BARs had not been well maintained after the war, few cleaning kits were issued, and the frozen over hell that most battles took place on caused frostlock in the weapon, a condition commonly fixed by the very technical act of pissing on the rifle. Still though, with its mobility, accuracy, and often reliable function, the BAR had its moments in the hostile Korean mountains, especially when repelling counterattacks and giving GIs a morale boost. But by the time everyone agreed to just sort of call it a draw, the M1918 was being phased out by the M14, a rifle that just couldn't really do anything right. You can't truly keep a good thing down though, and even in Vietnam the BAR made an appearance, interestingly on both sides of the conflict. GIs in the jungle came to appreciate the BAR as their predecessors had, given the massive shitstorm the newfangled M16 assault rifle became during its early deployments, while the North Vietnamese widely issued leftover French variants of the weapon after they'd kicked them out. However, by this time the once mighty Browning automatic rifle was far past its prime. Already relegated to mostly training and National Guard service in the US for over a decade, and seeing at most minor use in some early Cold War conflicts. Meanwhile, intermediate chambered assault rifles were becoming all the rage, while the retroactively named battle rifles, which included the BAR but also the later G3 and FAL, were falling out of favor with infantry forces. So, by the mid-1970s, the rifle designed to solve World War I trench warfare had slowly faded into obsolescence, closing the book on half a century of military service. When it comes to infantry small arms, few weapons can claim to have played a role in winning the two largest wars in human history. The BAR is undeniably an iconic rifle, having a service history that includes many of the intense wars in the early to mid-20th century and featuring in countless medal citations across its 50+ years of combat. But it was also plagued with issues throughout its life. It overheated easily, its recoil could be difficult to deal with in automatic fire, its magazines were small, they could become dirty quickly following sustained fire, and only a few 100,000 were ever made, a minuscule amount compared to the millions of small arms manufactured for the world wars. However, even with these shortcomings, along with the highly questionable effectiveness of the walking fire offensives it was designed to carry out, the value of the M1918's mobility, accuracy, and reliability during its extensive time in combat outweighed them all, made especially clear after it was retired. The US spent 2 decades trying to find a suitable replacement for Browning's design, which would ultimately become the venerable M249 squad automatic weapon, a weapon that improves on practically every aspect the BAR fell short in. While it has been overshadowed in the public consciousness by the likes of the M1 Garand, M1 Thompson, and M1 Carbine, the M1918 BAR was one of the most important weapons in the American arsenal from World War I through until the Cold War, but its understated popularity has kept it alive even today. Ohio Ordnance Works selling two modernized BAR variants, the M1918A3 SLR and the HCAR. And even the incredibly popular FN Mag uses an improved version of the BAR's action. Again, John Browning created a weapon that has stood the test of time, arming his nation for decades after his death and birthing one of the most iconic mid-20th century firearms. Be it in the hands of trench dwellers, bank robbers, beach stormers, and everyone outside or in between, the Browning automatic rifle provided the perfect compromise between a machine gun and a rifle to the world's militaries at a time when such a compromise was needed. It was a product of its time, but it did its job and more than made its mark. All in all, the M1918 BAR wasn't perfect, but it is an iconic firearm nonetheless. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. My apologies for this video taking so long, but I hope it was worth it. Thank you again for the support this channel has gotten recently. It's honestly unbelievable, and there's not much I can really articulate to properly express that, but I really appreciate it. That's all I've got for now. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.